kind of an amazing thing. Onesimus was in the house of a guy his house was the church. And he hadn't ever come to faith yet. Something must have happened with Paul that was a special situation. And Onesimus suddenly understood what the message of Jesus was all about. And so Onesimus becomes Paul's spiritual son there. Secondly, Paul says Onesimus is now useful, which is a cool little play on words because in Greek the word Onesimus means profitable. And yet Onesimus was a guy who took profit away from his master. So Paul is saying this guy who used to be worthless to you has now become useful. He's now profitable to you and to me. The third one, Paul says, Onesimus is my heart. And in parentheses next to that on your note sheet, I wrote the word guts. Because remember last week, if you were here last week, we talked about how Jesus was talking about living water streaming from within you, streaming from your heart. And he used one of these words that actually meant your guts, your insides. Well, another Greek word for the same thing is used here. It literally means your intestines. So Paul says, Onesimus is my intestines, which doesn't make sense to us. But in that culture, boy, it was as if he was disemboweling himself to give Onesimus back to Philemon. That's the picture you got to have. Paul loved this guy. Then he says, Onesimus could take your place with me. Philemon, you're stuck over there in Colossae. I'm in jail here in Rome, but you could come and help me. In fact, you couldn't come and help me because you need to stay there with the church, but you could send Onesimus and he could help me. Then Paul says, perhaps this whole situation is so you could have Onesimus not as a slave, but as a brother. Not as a slave, but as a brother. Better than a slave. And then this last one. Paul says, Onesimus is a man and your brother. That's important. He's your brother. This is very important, okay? Because, see, a lot of times people would say that Paul says slavery is a good thing, slavery is okay. And yet Paul right here is talking about an individual slave, and he's layering one on the other of all the kinds of arguments that should have been listened to hundreds of years ago for why slavery is wrong. He's someone that we can love. He's layering it on over and over. So it's very clear that Paul says he wants Philemon to let Onesimus go. Until we get to verse 17, and then it comes right out. He says, so, if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. Paul is not a slave. And if Paul were to show up in Colossae, Philemon would open his arms and say, come on in. Tell us everything you know about Jesus. Tell us everything you know about God and what he's been doing in your life. And tell us about Rome. But if Onesimus shows up, Philemon is tempted to kill the guy. He's tempted to wring out of his neck all the money he stole from him. And that's exactly the same story with you and with me. When someone takes advantage of us, all we want to do is just wring out of them what we lost. That's our problem. How do you do something nice for someone who has hurt you? How do you do something nice for someone who has ripped your life apart? How can you have a positive attitude towards someone who has torn you to pieces? See, what Paul is doing is he's taking himself and he's stepping in between Philemon and Onesimus. And he says to Philemon, when you look at Onesimus, look at me first. Look through me to see that guy, because he's my son. He's the one that I love. He's my heart. He's my life. And so Philemon, I tell you what. Let's go ahead and read verse 18. Paul gives Philemon a specific solution to this problem. He says, if Onesimus has done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to me. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will pay it back. Not to mention that you owe me your very self. This is the solution that Paul gives to Philemon. He says two things. Number one, he says, chalk his debt up to my account. He says, take Onesimus' debt and place it on my ledger book with you. That's the first thing Paul says. This is solution number one. Solution number two is Paul says to Philemon, oh, by the way, you owe me your very life. He's saying, listen, buddy, you owe me your life. This guy, I love him. This guy has taken a few $100s from you. I don't know how much it's been. He's caused you some disgrace because you're a slave owner who's lost his slave. Okay, there's some disgrace in that. But when he comes back, listen, I'm going to pay everything that he owes you, so how much do I owe you? Oh, by the way, don't you remember, you owe me your life. What Paul is doing here is something that is miraculously wise and profound. Because Paul is playing the role of Jesus in this situation. See, Philemon is this guy in the middle. Someone has done him wrong. He feels pain. And he doesn't want to be generous. He doesn't want to show favor to Onesimus. But Paul is saying, wait a minute. I'm going to step in the place of Jesus. Maybe you should even just think about Jesus at this place. How much of your life do you owe to him? Has this dude taken anything from you that Jesus can't pay? Has this person caused you any pain that Jesus can't cover? Has this person caused any damage to your life that Jesus can't restore? That's what Jesus says to you and to me, and that's what he's done for us before the Father in heaven. We had a massive debt, a huge debt that we couldn't pay to the Father in heaven because any sin is a travesty against the order of creation. And every time we've turned our back on God, that is like Onesimus running away, but on a much higher scale. And Jesus says, listen, I can cover that debt. And that's what he did for you. Take a look at these verses here. I wrote them down on your note sheet. In Romans 5:8, it says this, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were sinners, enemies, distant from God, runners away, thieves of God's blessings,